We've already heard the part of the story of the resurrection that happened at dawn on that day when the women came and found Jesus' tomb empty and heard from the angels. And in a minute, we're going to hear about what happened next and about how the different followers of Jesus responded to the resurrection. And that's where we're going to linger in the story about how they responded to the resurrection. Because as Chuck Swindoll said, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it. Before we read, I'm going to say that again because it seems important. Life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it. So before we read it, the rest of the story, I want to introduce you to improv comedy. I know some of you know about improv comedy. If you don't, I'll tell you about it in a minute. But both my husband Billy and my younger brother Dan were part of improv comedy groups in college. And it was a deeply formative experience for both of them. So improv comedy is comedy performed by a group of people without a script, as opposed to like stand-up comedy, which is typically just one person and it's all written out ahead of time. So in improv comedy, the team builds a scene or a story together on stage without knowing ahead of time what's going to happen. And what happens is always stranger or more hilarious or more beautiful than any one of the comedians on their own could have come up with. How do they do that? If you've ever seen improv comedy, it is a wonder to observe. How do they do that? How do they build this thing together that's bigger and better than the sum of its parts without any of them knowing where it's going to go ahead of time? They do it by following this one rule, and that rule is yes and. Yes and. Comedian Stephen Colbert, who's well-versed in improv comedy, says that yes and becomes a verb in improv comedy. So whatever the person before you says, you yes and it. So, and this is example Stephen Colbert himself uses. If the first person starts building a scene by saying, we're doctors, then the next person would yes and by saying, we're doctors and we're trapped in an ice cave. We'll hear him use that example in a video in a few minutes. And there's one thing that you're never supposed to do in improv comedy. There's one thing that if one person does it, the whole scene comes crashing down and the spirits of your fellow comedians are crushed, and that is to say no. To say something like, actually, we're not doctors, we're explorers in an ice cave. That is the one rule you do not break. You do not say no in improv comedy. The scene cannot be built that way. The one rule you must follow is yes and. So let's hear the story of what happens with the disciples after they hear about the resurrection. And as I read, I want you to listen for the yes ands in the story and the no's. So we're in Luke chapter 24. We're going to start in the second half of verse 5. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again. Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the disciples. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. So did you see any yes ands? Who yes anded the resurrection? And who knowed the resurrection? Let's look at those 3 verses. What about the women in verse 10? It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the disciples. Is that a yes and? Yes. They saw the resurrection, they said yes to it, and they took another step to tell someone about it. Well, what about the apostles who heard about it from the women? This is verse 11. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Did they yes and the resurrection? No. They dropped a big old no on that scene that Jesus was trying to set. Can you feel that fall flat? It was an idle tale, and they did not believe. What about Peter? In verse 12, but Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. Is this a yes and? Yes. Peter yes anded the resurrection by running and seeing for himself, which, by the way, running is a very undignified thing for Jewish men to do in those days because they wore long tunics. And you can't run with any lady who's worn a long dress will tell you it is not effective to run in a long tunic. So they would have to hike up their tunics in order to run without falling. But when you hike up your tunic, your legs show. And that would have been a very shameful thing for a Jewish man to do, to show his bare legs. But Peter didn't care. Peter was so caught up in his yes-anding that he didn't care if he looked like a fool. He was always impulsive, that Peter. He was the one who jumped out of the boat to walk on the water, to try to walk on the water when Jesus invited him to. He was the one who pulled out a sword and cut off the ear of the soldier when they were arresting Jesus. And he was the one who denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, just as Jesus said he would. I imagine Jesus remembered that Jesus had also said that he was going to rise from the dead in 3 days. I imagine him running, hoping beyond hope, disregarding his bare legs, hoping that what Jesus had said would come true this time too, that he would have a chance to say he was sorry and to receive forgiveness for denying Jesus. I wonder where you find yourself in these reactions to the resurrection. Maybe, and I know some of you are like this, and I rejoice in it, you've had a direct experience of this kind of unbelievable new life yourself. And you are yes-anding the resurrection. You're yes-anding what God is doing in your life by telling your story, just like the women did. Keep doing that because the world needs to hear it so much. Or are you like the apostles who decided that the resurrection was an idle tale that women tell? Or are you like Peter, who has a history of saying epic no's to God, who has a history of being impulsive in some ways that are amazing and in some ways that are foolish, and now you fall all over yourself to live into the yes and. Those apostles who thought it was an idle tale sound to me like they're experiencing a big dose of cynicism, like so many of us today. They can't hear any news without doubting the motives behind it. Cynical people can't trust the goodness of others. They're pessimistic. and they scorn good news in favor of the negative stuff that reinforces their own view of the world. My own view of the world. I can be pretty cynical too. It's understandable that the apostles would hesitate to believe. Their world had been torn apart when Jesus died. And if they believed this news, like they had maybe believed kind of when Jesus said he would rise again, if they believed this time, their world might fall apart again. Cynicism is a form of protection, after all. Cynicism is armor against hurt, but it's also a willful blindness to possibilities. And I think it's infecting all of us these days. I think cynicism is infecting all of us these days. And as a form of armor against hurt, it makes sense because the world is crazy right now. The world is crazy. There's a lot of things that threaten our well-being in the world, or our sense of well-being, if not our actual well-being. There's the war in Ukraine. There's political divisiveness that isn't just in Washington, but trickles all the way down to our dining room tables. There's COVID-19. There's global warming. And this past week, there was the shooting of Patrick Lyoya, an unarmed black man, by police right here in Grand Rapids, way too close to home. It's easy to respond to those things with cynicism. Assigning motives to whomever or whichever way makes us more comfortable. To keep the things at a safe distance that are the things that are really painful, to be cynical and to keep them at a safe distance because they seem like huge and insurmountable problems. But when we keep those things at a safe distance, we also remove the possibilities of saying yes and to what God is doing, even in the hard things. You can't be cynical and say yes and to what God is trying to build in the world. Cynicism might protect you from future pain, but it also blocks you from all the ways that your life could flourish, all the ways that you could participate in the flourishing of the world by witnessing that empty grave. Do you call it an idle tale? Whether it's the hard stories that people tell or the joyful stories that people share, do you keep it at arm's length or do you let it into your heart? You can't let everything into your heart. I know that. It's not safe. Nobody can live like that. We just don't have the capacity to let everything in. But when you keep it all out, you keep it all out. Stephen Colbert talks about building something with yes and through improv. He does it brilliantly in this section of a speech we're going to watch together. The speech is from 2006. That's why it's blurry. 2006 doesn't feel like that long ago, but when you see it on the screen, it looks like a long time ago. We're going to watch this speech to graduates at Knox College in Illinois. Did you know that Stephen Colbert is a Christian? He's pretty open about that, but he doesn't talk about it explicitly super often. He doesn't explicitly mention it here, but this idea of living into the hope of new life comes through loud and clear in his speech. So let's watch Stephen Colbert.
So say yes. In fact, say yes as often as you can. When I was starting out in Chicago, I was doing improvisational theater at the Second City and other places. There was really only one rule I was taught about improv, and that was yes and. In this case, yes and is a verb. To yes and. I yes and, you yes and, he, she, or it yes ands. And yes anding means that when you go on stage to improvise a scene with no script, you have no idea what's going to happen, maybe with someone you have never met before, to build a scene, you have to accept, to build anything on stage, you have to accept what the other improvisers initiate on stage. They say, you're doctors, you're doctors. And then you add to that, we're doctors and we're trapped in an ice cave. That's the and. And then hopefully they yes and you back. You have to keep your eyes open to do this. You have to be aware of what the other performer is offering you so that you can agree and add to it. And through these agreements, you can improvise a scene or a one-act play. And because by following each other's lead, neither of you are really in control, it's more of a mutual discovery than a solo invention. What happened in the scenes is often as much of a surprise to you as it is to the audience. Well, you are about to start the greatest improvisation of all. With no script, no idea what's going to happen, often with people and places you have never seen before, and you are not in control. So say yes. And if you're lucky, find people who will say yes back. Now, will saying yes get you in trouble at times? Will saying yes lead you to do some foolish things? Yes, it will. But don't be afraid to be a fool. Remember, you cannot be both young and wise. Young people who pretend to be wise to the ways of the world are mostly just cynics. Cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but it is the farthest thing from it, because cynics don't learn anything, because cynicism is a self-imposed blindness, a rejection of the world because we are afraid it will hurt us or disappoint us. Cynics always say no. But saying yes begins things. Saying yes is how things grow. Saying yes leads to knowledge. Yes is for young people. So for as long as you have the strength to, say yes. And that's the word.
Friends, God began something. Well, God began something at creation, and God continued that something at the resurrection. That is the scene that God is setting on the stage of the world, and you are invited to add your yes and. You are invited to turn away from the cynicism that says no, and to turn toward yes and, to bring this new thing into the world that God is working on and wants us all to be part of. We have an incredible God who invites us into partnership. So, I invite you to take just one no that you've been saying. Maybe you've been saying it to God explicitly. Maybe you've been saying it to something out in the news. Maybe you've been saying it to someone in your life. Take that no and take a step this week to turn it into a yes and. Find the place where God is inviting you to say a yes and, to say yes and to add your goodness, your ideas, all of the things that the Holy Spirit puts in your heart. Add your yes and. Let's join together in prayer. God, thank you for the courage of those women at the empty tomb who continued the long line of yes and. Thank you for Peter, who continued the long line of yes and even after his epic no's. And we thank you for those apostles that we can see ourselves in, who wanted to stay safe, who needed not to go on the roller coaster of yes and. Thank you for being gentle with us when we are in those no spaces. And give us the courage to participate in this scene that you are building in the world by adding our yes ands in the unique way that only us as individuals can because of the gifts that you have given to us. We love you, and the best parts of us want to be part of your story. Give us the courage to do that today. In your name, amen.